Well, hello, listeners. Are you ready for chapter 11? I am too. All right, get that coffee, that hot tea, do that gardening, get your cozy blankets, because we're going to read a naughty book. All right, chapter 11. I didn't give myself a chance to panic, to doubt, to do anything but wish I had stolen some food from my breakfast table as I layered on tunic after tunic and bundled myself in a cloak, stuffing the knife I'd stolen into my boot. The extra clothes in the satchel would just be a burden to carry. My father, my father had come to take me, to save me. Whatever benefits Tamlin had given him upon my departure couldn't have been too tempting then. Maybe he had a ship prepared to take us far, far away. Maybe he had somehow sold the cottage and gotten enough money to set us up in a new place on a new continent. My father, my crippled, broken father, had come. A quick survey of the ground beneath my window revealed no one was outside, and the silent house told me that no one had spotted my father yet. He was still waiting by the hedge, now beckoning me. At least Tamlin had not returned. With a final glance at my room, listening for anyone approaching from the hall, I grasped the nearby trellis of wisteria and eased down the building. Oh, she's going to get herself in trouble! I winced at the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, but my father was already moving toward the outer gates, limping along with his cane. How had he even gotten here? There had to be horses nearby then. He was hardly wearing enough clothing for the winter that would await us once we crossed the wall. But I'd layered on so much that I could spare him some items if need be. Keeping my movements light and silent, carefully avoiding the light of the moon, I hurried after my father. He moved with surprising swiftness toward the darkened hedges and the gate beyond. Girl, you know how it's always like that one person that dies in the horror movie because they trip when they're running? It's like, I feel like that's what's taking place. Only a few hall candles were burning inside of the house. I didn't dare breathe too loudly. I didn't dare call for my father as he limped toward the gate. If we left now, if he indeed had horses, we could be halfway home by the time they realized I was even gone. Then we'd flee Tamlin, flee the blight that could soon invade our lands. My father reached the gates. They were already open, the dark forest beyond beckoning. He must have hidden the horses deeper in. He turned toward me, that familiar face drawn and tight, those brown eyes clear for once, and beckoned. Hurry, hurry! Every movement of his hand seemed to shout. My heart was a raging beat in my chest, in my throat. Only a few feet now to him, to freedom, to a new life. A massive hand wrapped around my arm. Going somewhere? Shit. Tamlin's claws poked through my layers of clothing as I looked up at him in an unbanished terror. I didn't dare move, not as his lips thinned and the muscles in his jaw as they quivered. Not as he opened his mouth and I glimpsed his fangs. Long, throat-tearing fangs shining in the moonlight. He was going to kill me right there, and then kill my father. No more loopholes, no more flattery, no more mercy. He didn't care anymore. I was good as dead. Please, I breathed. My father. Your father? He lifted his stare to the gates behind him, and his growl rumbled through me as he bared his teeth. Why don't you look again? He then released me. I staggered back a step, whirling, sucking in a breath to tell my father to run. But he wasn't there. Only a pale bow and a quiver of pale arrows remained, propped up against the gates. Mountain ash. They hadn't been there moments before. Hadn't they rippled, as if they were nothing but water. And then the bow and quiver became a large pack laden with supplies. Another ripple. And there were my sisters, huddled together, weeping. My knees buckled. What is? I didn't finish the question. My father now stood there, still hunched and beckoning. A flawless rendering. Weren't you warned to keep your wits about you? Tamlin snapped. That your human senses would betray you? He stepped beyond me and let out a snarl so vicious that whatever the thing was by those gates shimmered with light and darted as fast as lightning, streaking through the dark. Fool, he said to me, turning. If you're ever going to run away, at least do it in the daytime. He stared me down, and the fangs slowly retracted. The claws remained. There are worse things than the bogue prowling these woods at night. That thing at the gates isn't one of them. And it still would have taken a good long devouring of you. Somehow, my mouth began working again. All of the things to say. I blurted, "Can you blame me? My crippled father appears beneath my window, and you think I'm going to not run for him? Did you actually think I'd gladly stay here forever, even if you'd taken care of my family, all for some treaty that had nothing to do with me and allows your kind to slaughter humans as you see fit?" He flexed his fingers as if trying to get the claws back in. But they remained out, ready to slice through flesh and bone. "What do you want, Farah?" "I want to go home." "Home to what exactly?" "You'd prefer that miserable human existence to this?" I made a promise, I said, breathing ragged, "to my mother when she died, that I'd look after my family, that I'd take care of them. All I have done every single day, every hour, has been for that vow. And just because I was hunting to save my family, to put food in their bellies, I'm now forced to break it." He stalked toward the house, and I gave him a wide berth before falling into step behind him. His claws slowly retracted. He didn't look at me as he said, "You are not breaking your vow. You are fulfilling it, and then some, by staying here. Your family is better cared for now than they were when you were there." Those chipped, miscolored paintings inside the cottage flashed in my vision. Perhaps they would forget who had even painted them in the first place. Insignificant. That's what all those years I'd given them would be, as insignificant as I was to these high fae. And that dream I'd had of one day living with my father, with enough food and money and paint, it had been my dream and no one else's. I rubbed at my chest. I can't just give up on it, on them, no matter what you say. Even if I had been a fool, a stupid human fool, to believe my father would ever actually come for me? Tamlin eyed me sidelong. "You're not giving up on them. Living in luxury, stuffing myself with food. How is that not? They are cared for, they are fed, and they are comfortable." Fed and comfortable. If he couldn't lie, if it was true, then it was beyond anything I dared ever hope for. Then my vow to my mother was fulfilled. It stunned me enough that I didn't say anything for a moment as we walked. My life was now owned by the treaty, but perhaps I'd been freed in another sort of way. We neared the sweeping stairs that led into the manor, and I finally asked Lucien. "Lucien goes on border patrol, and you've mentioned other sentries, yet I've never seen one here. Where are they all?" "At the border," he said, as if that were a suitable answer. Then he added, "We don't need sentries if I'm here," because he was deadly enough. I tried not to think about it, but still I asked, "Were you trained as a warrior then?" "Yes." When I didn't reply, he added, "I spent most of my life in my father's war band on the borders, training as a warrior to one day serve him or others. Running these lands was not supposed to fall to me." The flatness with which he said it told me enough about how he felt about his current title, about why the presence of his silver-tongued friend was necessary. But it was too personal, too demanding, to ask what had occurred to change his circumstances so greatly. So I cleared my throat, and I said, "What manner of fairies prowl the woods beyond this gate, if the bogue isn't the worst of them?" What was that thing? What I meant to ask was, what would have tormented and then eaten me? Who are you to be so powerful that they pose no threat to you? This is getting freaky. He paused on the bottom step, waiting for me to catch up. A puka. They use your own desires to lure you to some remote place, and then they eat you, and not in a good way. Slowly, it probably smelled your human scent in the woods and followed it to the house. I shivered and didn't bother to hide it. Tamlin went on. These lands used to be well guarded. The deadlier fairies were contained within the borders of their native territories, monitored by the local Fey lords or driven into hiding. Creatures like the puka never would have dared set foot here. But now, the sickness that infected Prithian has weakened the wards that kept them out. Long pause, like the words were choked out of him. Things are different now. It's not safe to travel alone at night, especially if you're human. Because humans were defenseless as babes compared to natural-born predators like Lucian. And Tamlin, who didn't need weapons to hunt. I glanced at his hands, but found no trace of the claws. Only tanned, calloused skin. She's always like, tanned skin. What else is different now? I asked, trailing him up the marble front steps. He didn't stop this time, didn't even look over his shoulder to see me as he said everything. Oh, what does that mean, Tamlin? Why has everything changed? The listeners want to know. So I was truly to live there forever. As much as I longed to ensure that Tamlin's word about caring for my family was true, as much as his claim that I was taking better care of my family by staying away, even if I was truly fulfilling that vow to my mother by staying in Prithian, without the weight of that promise, I was left hollow and empty. Over the next 3 days, I found myself joining Lucian on Andreas's old patrol while Tamlin hunted the grounds for the bow, unseen by us. Despite being an occasional bastard, Lucian didn't seem to mind my company, and he did most of the talking, which was fine. It left me to brood over the consequences of firing a single arrow. An arrow. I never fired a single one during those 3 days we rode along the border. That very morning, I'd spied a red doe in a glen and aimed out of instinct. My arrow poised to fly right into her eye as Lucian sneered that she was not a fairy, at least. But I stared at her, fat and healthy and content, and then slackened the bow, placed the arrow in my quiver, and let the doe wander on. Ooh, she's changing. I never saw Tamlin around the manor. Off hunting with the bow, day and night, Lucian informed me. Even at dinner, he spoke little before leaving early, off to continue his hunt, night after night. I didn't mind his absence. It was a relief, if anything. Girl, you know you'd be lying. On the third night after my encounter with the puka, I'd scarcely sat down before Tamlin got up, giving an excuse about not wanting to waste hunting time. Lucy and I stared after him for a moment. What I could see of Lucian's face was pale and tight. You worry about him, I said. Lucian slumped in his seat, wholly undignified for a Feylord. Tamlin gets into moods. He doesn't want your help hunting the bogue. He prefers being alone and having the bogue on our lands. I don't suppose you'd understand. The puka are minor enough not to bother him. But even after he's shredded the bogue, he'll brood over it. And there's no one who can help him at all? He would probably shred them for disobeying his order to stay away. Lucian studied the wine in his goblet. You don't hold on to power by being everyone's friend. And among the fairies, lesser and high fae alike, a firm hand is needed. We're too powerful and too bored with immortality to be checked by anything else. It seemed like a cold, lonely position to have, especially when you didn't particularly want it. I wasn't sure why it bothered me so much. The snow was falling, thick and merciless, already up to my knees as I pulled the bowstring back, farther and farther until my arm trembled. Behind me, a shadow lurked, No, watched. I didn't dare turn to look at it, to see who might be within that shadow, observing, not as the wolf stared at me across the clearing, just staring, as if waiting, as if daring me to fire the ash arrow. No, I didn't want to do it. Not this time. Not again. Not. But I had no control over my fingers. Absolutely none, and he was still staring as I fired. One shot straight through that golden eye. A plume of blood splattering the snow, a thud of heavy body, a sigh of wind. No, it wasn't a wolf that hit that snow. No, it was a man. Tall and well-formed. No, not a man. A high fae with those pointed ears. I blinked. Then my hands were warm and sticky with blood. Then his body was red and skinless, steaming in the cold. It was his skin. His skin that I held in my hands, and I threw myself awake, sweat slipping down my back, and forced myself to breathe, to open my eyes and know each detail of the night dark bedroom. Real. This was real. But I could still see that high fae male. Face down in the snow, my arrow through his eye, red and bloody all over from where I'd cut and peeled off his skin. Bile stung my throat. Not real. It was just a dream. Even if what I'd done to Andreas, even as Wolf, was... I scrubbed my face. Perhaps it was the quiet, the hollowness of the past few days. Perhaps it was only that I no longer had to think hour to hour about how to keep my family alive. But it was regret, and maybe shame, that coated my tongue, my bones. I shuddered as if I could fling it off, and kicked back the sheets to rise from the bed. Oh my gosh, chapter 12. You guys ready for chapter 12? Because I am too. All right. I couldn't entirely shake the horror, the gore of my dream as I walked down the dark halls of that manor. The servants and Lucian long since asleep. But I had to do something, anything, after that nightmare. If only to avoid sleeping. A bit of paper in one hand and a pen gripped in the other, I carefully traced my steps, noting the windows and doors and exits, occasionally jotting down vague sketches and X's on the parchment. It was the best I could do, and to any literate human, my markings would have made no sense. But I couldn't write or read more than basic letters, and my makeshift map was better than nothing. And if I were to remain here, it was essential to know the best hiding places, the easiest way out, should things ever go badly for me. I couldn't entirely let go of the instinct. Of course not. It was too dim to admire any of the paintings lining the walls, and I didn't dare risk a candle. These past 3 days, there had been servants in the halls when I'd worked up the nerve to go look at the art. And then part of me that spoke with Nesta's voice had laughed at the idea of an ignorant human trying to admire fairy art. Some other time then, I told myself, I would find another day, a quiet hour when no one was around, to look at them. I had plenty of hours now, a whole lifetime in front of me, perhaps. Perhaps I'd figure out what I wished to do with it. I crept down the main staircase, moonlight flooding the black and white tiles of the entrance hall. I reached the bottom, my bare feet silent on the cold tiles, and listened. Nothing. No one. I set my little map on the foyer table and drew a few X's and circles to signify the doors, the windows, the marble stairs of the front hall. I would become so familiar with the house that I could navigate it even if someone blinded me. A breeze announced his arrival, and I turned from the table toward the long hall to open the glass doors to the garden. I'd forgotten how huge he was in this form. Sorry, I got distracted by the fact that she said he was huge in this form. Forgotten the curled horns and lupine face, the bear-like body that moved with a feline fluidity. His green eyes glowed in the darkness, fixing on me, and as the doors snicked shut behind him, the clicking of claws on marble filled the hall. I stood there, not daring to flinch, to move a muscle. He limped slightly, and in the moonlight, dark, shining stains were left in his wake. Uh-oh. He continued toward me, stealing the air from the entire hall. He was so big that the space felt cramped like a cage. The scrape of a claw, a huff, uneven breathing, dripping of the blood. Between one step and the next, he changed forms, and I squeezed my eyes shut at the blinding flash. When at last my eyes adjusted to the returning darkness, he was standing in front of me. Standing, but not quite there. No sign of the baldric or his knives. His clothes were in shreds. Long, vicious slashes that made me wonder how he wasn't gutted and dead. But the muscled skin peering out beneath the shirt was smooth and unharmed. Did you kill the bogue? My voice was hardly more than a whisper. Yes, a dull, empty answer. As if he couldn't be bothered to remember to be pleasant. As if I were at the very, very bottom of a long list of priorities. Well, yeah, he's hurt. You're hurt, I said, even more quietly. Indeed. His hand was covered in blood, even more splattering on the floor beneath him. He looked at it blankly, as if it took some monumental effort to remember that he had even had a hand and that it was injured. What effort of will and strength had it taken to kill the bogue, to face that wretched menace? How deep had he had to dig himself? To whatever immortal power and animal that lived there, to kill it? He glanced down at the map on the table, and his voice was void of anything, any emotion, any anger, any amusement, as he said, "What is that?" I snatched at the map. I thought I should learn my surroundings. Drip, drip, drip. I opened my mouth to point out his hand again, but he said, "You can't write, can you?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. Ignorant, insignificant human. No wonder you became so adept at other things. I suppose he was so far gone in thinking about his encounter with the bogue that he hadn't realized the compliment that he'd given me. If it was a compliment. Another splatter of blood on the marble. Where can we clean up your hand? He lifted his head to look at me again, still and silent and weary. Then he said, "There's a small infirmary." Yes, take her into there. Just kidding. I'm sure she's just going to fix him up. I wanted to tell myself that it was probably the most useful thing I'd learned all night, but as I followed him there, avoiding the blood he trailed, I thought of what Lucian had told me about his isolation, that burden. Thought of what Tamlin had mentioned about how those estates should not have been his, and felt sorry for him. The infirmary was well stocked, but was more of a supply closet with a workable table than an actual place to host sick fairies. I suppose that was all they needed when they could heal themselves with their immortal powers, but this wound